Yeah. So supposedly we're live now. I'm trying to just make sure everything on my channel is good to go. Does seem to be the case. All right. Yeah, we're good. We're game. Cool. I am gonna go ahead and hop over to our main here. Let's see. There we go. There's everyone's lovely faces. All right. Um, so hello everyone, and welcome to our final stream on The Democrats: A Critical History by Lance Salfa. I have a big gang with me today. It was just 7 people here on this stream. I'm really excited for that. I don't think I've ever had that many people on a study group stream before. Um, last time we covered kind of the first half of this book, The Democrats: A Critical History by Lance Salfa. We talked about how the kind of the origins of the party um, as the party of the slave owning class and the planters, and what Lance Salfa calls has a chapter called the history's second most enthusiastic capitalist party, kind of detailing the history of the Democrats and their connections with kind of big business. So this time we are going to start talking about kind of the main topics today are going to be about how the Democrats kind of co-opt social movements and how they are really imbricated with the imperialism that the United States executes as foreign policy. So that's going to be kind of the main focus. And like the other thing, other final big topic we're going to be covering is this big kind of thing that a lot of people are talking about nowadays, especially around kind of DSA discourse, which is can the left use the Democratic Party for our ends? And the case is made in this book that no, that's a terrible idea. And I agree with that. I'm not saying I don't speak for all of my co-hosts, but we'll see. Um, so anyhow, without further ado, I'd like to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. Why don't you go ahead and do your name, your pronouns, and um, maybe you can kind of describe your politics, like if you're a Marxist or an anarchist or whatever. You don't have to if you don't want to. Uh, and why you think it's important for leftists today to read this book. So I'll go ahead and start. I'm Melody, she, her pronouns. This is my channel called A World to Win, where I host study groups like this and make videos about history and political theory from a Marxist perspective. I'm self-described as a Marxist-Leninist. I'm an organizer with the Portland chapter of Democratic Socialists of America. I'm also the vice chair of the Young Democratic Socialists of America at Portland State University. And I think that this book is really critical to read, not just in terms of kind of exposing the Democrats for kind of the very like right-wing capitalist party that they are, exposing their kind of faux wokeness and their like, faux, working man's party, whatever you want to call it. Their whole thing is a very kind of aesthetic, shallow politics that ultimately serves the ruling class and empire. So that's why I think this book is really important to read. Um, anyhow, yeah, we'll get into more to that later. Everyone else, please go ahead and uh, go around and introduce yourselves. So apparently folks can't hear you. Can you try talking again? Sorry about that. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get everything ironed out here. Eve says she can hear clicking. Alice, go ahead and talk again. I want to see if I can get this working. Oh, I think I see the problem. Maybe. Me. Here, give that a shot. Can folks chat? Let me know if you can hear Alice now.
Hello, and am I coming through? Can everyone hear me? Please say yes, smiley face, something in chat. Let me know.
Please
I've
drop a B in the chat if you can hear Alice. Please press B.
Yeah, I've got the chat pulled up on my phone, so I'm kind of looking over at that just to double check and make sure.
Okay, yeah, I think they can. Yay! Okay, sorry.
Okay, excellent.
Sorry,
Well, just kind of
everyone. Alice is gonna go ahead and reintroduce herself. That was I changed one of the audio settings on my end. Sorry about that.
the same thing happened to me when I tried streaming with this new mic for the first time. Okay, so hello, Alice Evelyn Rabinowitz is my name. I am a trans woman from Portland, Oregon, with the side gig of being a Marxist YouTuber. Formerly considered myself an anarchist, but again, just with the socio-political moment that we're living in right now, I've stepped back and started studying Marxism and Marxism-Leninism, and I've found that I relate to those quite a bit more. And it just feels a bit more sensible for where we are as a country right now. And as far as why I think this book is really critical is, not just for leftists like ourselves, but I think, general working class, middle class Americans, this book could potentially help people really understand that the Democratic Party is not your friend. These people are not here to help you. They are selling you snake oil. They will swindle you. They will lie to you. And every narrative they spin about them being for the people is nothing but an illusion. And I think because so much frustration has been building with the disillusionment from Obama, the effect that Trump has had on our society, this is a really good moment to capitalize on and, hopefully help people channel their frustrations and their anxieties into actually understanding the two-party system for what it is. So I would definitely recommend it for sure.
Simba, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Hey, I'm Simba. Uh, they them, and I'm on theoretical and historiographical kind of debates or historical debates. Typically, I am most in agreement with Marxist-Leninist, principled Marxist-Leninist history and stuff, and so that's sort of what I favor. Um, And I think this book is important to read because it really helps you contextualize, not in an academic way or anything, like a super academic way, but contextualize the current kind of schism between the democratic establishment and their sort of social democratic counterparts. And it helps you really understand that contradiction within the party is not a defect, and the establishment isn't doing something badly. All of the contradictions within the Democratic Party are the intentional sort of development of smooth functioning political machinery, and it's very, very good at explaining that. Lance Selfa did an amazing job here.
Now, whoever would like to go next. Mary, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
I got you. Okay. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, there
we
you go.
can.
Is that any better? Okay, cool. Yay! Hi, everyone. I'm Mary, or Snarknotes. I have been calling myself an anarcho-communist, but I feel like I could be persuaded into Marxism or Marxist-Leninism. open to things, you know? So yeah, I really enjoyed this book because like over the past few years, I've obviously been growing disillusioned with the Democratic Party myself. And this book really helped me kind of like put like maybe like a historical and theoretical framework behind that. And I feel like that could happen with a lot of other people too if I, chose to read this. I was thinking about that the tweet that Chuck Schumer had the other day when he was like, "We're never gonna stop fighting for the working people of this country," and obviously that's a total fabrication. And I think this book kind of does a really good job of outlining why the Democrats have kind of been able to align themselves with working people, at least in name, but will never give us the vehicle for change that we actually need for working people and other marginalized groups. So
Real quick, Mary. I don't know if this is just for me, but I'm your audio is coming through really crackly.
Okay. If I'm like really close to the microphone, is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Cool. I will sit right here then. Do you want me to like say anything again or?
No, that's all right. I think
cool. Okay.
It was just it was just a little bit choppy. We'll be okay. Whoever wants to go next, go ahead.
Okay, cool.
Okay, yeah. Oh. Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead. So I'm Alki, Black anarchist who covers labor history on YouTube. The reason I think people should read the book, it boils down to two reasons. One, and probably I think the biggest thing for me is, can we push the Democrats to the left? No. But of course, we'll expand more on that. But also, I think the biggest thing as well is the potential to create a party that is actually left, like, right? And a party that's actually left to the Democrats. I think that since 2000, like this possibility of a left party, it's quite clear that we can create one. It's just actually doing it and actually being, willing to say, hey, we're not going to associate with the Democrats. We're not going to try and push them left. But of course, we'll expand more on that during this session.
Can't hear you. You're muted. Nope. Still can't hear you. Nope, no luck still.
Oh no.
Do you have a native like computer mic? Oh.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, hi, hello.
Okay. I don't know what happened. Yeah. Wow. What a reaction to everyone's so excited. That's great. It's great to like see/hear a bunch of voices and names of people I know through Twitter and YouTube. I don't know if I phrased that right, but you get what I'm trying to say. So it's nice to meet some of you and to see some of you again. So my name is Queer POTUS, and I do videos on YouTube about history, about presidents. I am gender non-binary, but pronouns are not super important for me. I would accept they, them. That would be the best, but I also okay with he, him. I mean, I'm more just generally concerned with like not being like boxed in by the patriarchy in a more general sense, but he, him, or they, them is fine either way. So let's see. This book. So I think that the Democratic Party needs to be demystified, as all things in bourgeois democracy need to be demystified. And a close reading of the history of the Democratic Party can show, that it's sort of a machine that was built over time, and it's not this like force for good that was assembled with all the best, nicest people who care about you to go and stop mean Orange Man or whatever the enemy is of the time. But that the Democratic Party is actually so intertwined with the Republican Party. There's like this back and forth, and they're so deep into each other that like it's impossible not to elect a Republican at this point. I think that's something we all agree with because Obama himself said he was a Republican. Hillary Clinton was raised like in a pro-Nixon household, and her husband's presidency, he was very conservative in a lot of ways, and he was a conservative governor. He rose up in the age of Reagan as this like Democrat who would work within Reaganomics, and Joe Biden is going to be a Republican. So it's to demystify this idea that there's two parties and that one fights for the working people and the other one, I don't know, just like hates Mexicans or something. And there's actually more to it than that. So I really want to get into that.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. I think that's everyone. We've all introduced ourselves. So yeah, without further ado, I'm just going to explain to our viewers here, our listeners/viewers, how we work these streams for folks who have not joined us for our study group streams before. We are going to basically spend the first portion of time here summarizing the chapters that we read for this session, and then we're going to have kind of an open discussion afterwards. And this is really kind of informal, trying to keep it kind of like a fireside chat, like tea and beer with your comrades, right? So feel free, of course, to make your comments and questions in the chat. And, there's 7 of us here. I'm sure somebody will have some kind of response to it. And, of course, we're not like a panel of experts or anything, so we don't know everything. But if we have, a good answer, we might be able to share it with you. And for folks who want to follow along, we are using the 2012 edition from Haymarket Books of The Democrats: A Critical History, and I will post a link to a digital copy in the chat so that you can follow along, and comrades on stream, if you want to reference specific page numbers and that sort of thing, they do match perfectly with the those in the digital copy. So I am going to go ahead and just share that in the chat right now, and then I'm going to pass things over to Alice. So, oops, don't pay no attention to that. That was not correct. I'm going to hand things over to Alice so we can get started with chapter 5 of this book. So, Alice, if you're ready, go ahead and take us away.
Absolutely. So I'm actually I'm really glad that chapter 5 is the one I ended up covering because just for those of you that I'm speaking to for the first time, I live in Portland, and this city has been ground zero for, not just the Black Lives Matter protests, like seeing the rise of the police state in person, the rise of fascist militias, but I think in a lot of ways, my involvement with them really showed me in person the ways in which the democratic establishment will try to worm its way into any and all social movements possible in order to defang them and stop them in their tracks. And there's one example in particular I want to give before I get directly into chapter 5, since it kind of sets up the main themes of chapter 5, where it was probably, I want to say, the third night of protests, which was the biggest night for us. We assembled in front of the Justice Center. We stayed there for about 2 hours, and then there was a march being planned to Burnside Bridge, and we found out that this particular march was being led by a group called Rose City Justice. And what they were saying, a lot of the leaders from this group were there, and they were like, so there are police waiting for us on the other side of this bridge. So what we're going to do is we're going to move as a unit. We're going to go and face them and then stay there and essentially hold the bridge. When we got to the bridge, there were no police there, but instead there were TV crews on the other side, all filming, taking our pictures, and all of the leaders walked over to and met the TV crews, chatted with them, and then came back to us. And we found out that what had happened was they had been planning this with media companies in the city for a while. And what they did as soon as we got to the bridge is they started screaming things like, "This is a peaceful protest. This is a peaceful protest. We will be peaceful. We will vote. We will use our power in appropriate ways." And they were just saying this over and over and over again. So I did a little bit of research on the organization, and I found out that they've been doing things like this where they try to shush the more radical side of these movements and presents a very liberalized version of protesting as the correct way to protest. Which is fascinating because so I wrote a few lines to summarize chapter 5 that go as, "For as long as the Democratic Party has existed, it has relentlessly worked to defang and neuter any and all social and labor movements that would seek to challenge its constituency and hold on electoral power, wealth, as well as any sector of public life that they can sink their teeth into. They exist to siphon wealth and power away from us. They will only make vague concessions and surface level gestures towards moving in a more progressive direction if it means that there's something in it for them. And they fight so aggressively against us because they're well aware of how powerful and mobilized a pissed off proletariat is." And even from the very beginning of the Democratic Party, this was part of their nature. I love how on page 125 it gets into the Populist Party, which I was actually not aware of before I read this. But there's one part that quotes Howard Zinn. I have all of this on a notepad. If y'all are following along in the book, I don't offhand know which paragraph this is, but it says, in quoting Howard Zinn, "It was a time, as election times have often been in the United States, to consolidate the system after years of protest and rebellion. Where a threatening mass movement developed, the two-party system stood ready to send out one of its columns to surround that movement and drain it of vitality." So essentially what was happening during this era is that the Populist Party was gaining popularity and support. And at that time was the best opportunity that workers and ordinary Americans had had to actually having a proper opposition to the two parties, which are both anti-union, they're anti-worker, they're anti-socialist. And it looks like they would actually be able to build the momentum to counter them. But what happened was they were struggling to get enough members. They were struggling to actually have any sort of real pull in society. So what happened was they started little by little making small alliances with the Democratic Party because at the time the logic was, well, we don't have that many resources, so there's really only so much we can do. So even if though we don't like doing this, we recognize, these people are working against us. If we can maybe make these small alliances, this may help us in the long run. But what it ended up doing is the Democratic Party just drained them of all life and little by little collapsed them until there was nothing. And the effect this ended up having was there was no, and this is quoting the book, there was no movement from below to challenge them being white supremacist Democrats. So it was really one of the earlier examples of showing what happens if you try to make concessions with this party and you believe that working with them will in some way help your movement. Even back in the 1890s, this is not what happened because the Democrats took the opportunity, they crushed the movement, they absorbed some of it into their party, and in the process, they became more powerful, they gained more votes, they gained more seats, thus further rooting themselves into American society. Um, and this was a really, really fascinating read for me because I have a roommate who's very studied on these particular parts of history, and I saw so many things pop up that we had talked about at the time, especially with the New Deal during the Great Depression. I grew up in East Texas, so y'all can probably imagine what my history classes were like. And I remember really distinctly there the way that people in my school labeled FDR was someone who bloated the economy, who ended up being really bad for the country. But the reason they said he was bad is because he was instituting policies that produced too much welfare, produced too many reliant people on the government, which again echoes the modern conservative mindset. Um, but not saying a word about how what it actually did was it helped capitalist interests. And it ended up not really doing that much for the millions upon millions upon millions of people who were stuck in poverty, and they were essentially left with almost nothing. Like, you look at what's happening with COVID right now. I haven't seen the latest statistics, but I want to say there are like either 9 million recent people out of the workforce, if not more. And what's happening is, like, with this government especially, they're not giving anything to people who are struggling. So it's like we're seeing a repeat of the Great Depression, but it's only been further exacerbated. Where now, I think I saw an article that said billionaires in this country have now amassed $1 trillion worth of wealth since the pandemic began. And all of that came from
Yay.
legislation that Democrats in part wrote. So it's like, again, the only thing they're doing is, like, even whenever the people are in a desperate situation, even whenever there are these burgeoning movements and people demanding help, they're demanding equality. The only thing they do is they're like, yeah, we'll help you. Let's a few shillings to you, and then maybe you can, like, scamper off to your house and stop complaining so much. Listen, we were having a really nice dinner party with all our fellow politicians. You're making the proceedings just a little bit sad. Can you just go? Is basically how they treated everyone. Um, and I have a few quotes I just want to go over real quick. There was one bit I wrote about power is what matters to them, not a single one of us. I have a friend who described the two-party system as the two heads of the capitalist hydra. And regardless of, how much power we gain, how much mobility we have in this country, they're going to do everything they can to throw us off course, to weaken us. And I was really interested. There's a section that starts on page 136 that dives into McCarthyism. And this is where I've discovered a connection between Red Scare propaganda given by the right and McCarthyism that the Democrats will often talk about. There's a quote that says, Ellen Schrecker, a historian of McCarthyism, concluded that organized labor was the most important institutional victim of the Cold War Red Scare because many labor leaders tied to Democrats collaborated with the witch hunts. And McCarthyism weakened the entire labor movement, damaging communists and anti-communists alike. Page 137 goes into the Dems began moving to the right as demagogic anti-communists began to take control of Congress and the media. In the South, the accelerating anti-communist rhetoric had the effect of cloaking segregationist and anti-union appeals with a new degree of patriotic respectability. So if you look at, like, Fox News nowadays, what sort of things do they say about anti-fascist protesters? And, like, how do they even treat very passionate union activists? They constantly, over and over again, sort of like a modern day Pavlov's test, use the term communists as a way to scare people, but try to prevent people from, like, actually trying to understand, why do these movements happen? What are they advocating for? It's just fear, 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 fear. They're trying to deflect people away from that because they only want you to go so far. But if you encroach too closely on their interests with whichever movement is you're a part of, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the movement for queer rights, trans rights, workers' rights, all of this, if you get too close to their bubble, they're going to push back with whatever force they deem necessary. Um, Essentially, like, in some ways, saying that people like us were conspiring with the Soviet Union. So taking it not just from people being a threat to this country, but conspiring with foreign powers who have also been deemed like the greatest threat to American security. So it paints us as enemies within the state. Again, we see the example of the state turning people against each other for their own interests. This is just one of the ways that they do that. And it goes into it again on page 140, especially with the Kennedy administration, who preferred that civil rights groups pursue voting rights through a legal strategy rather than take direct action against segregation, which parallels what Kennedy did with what I witnessed with Rose City Justice, where they were saying, no, no, no. What we need to do is vote. We need to be respectful. Don't be aggressive with the police. Work with them. Listen to them. If they tell you to go home, you go home. Okay? This is how you make a difference in the country. And all the politicians who came before us would be very proud. Let me scan through here to see what else we had. Oh, there was one part in particular that actually really shocked me. So I was well aware of the government's sending orders to have Fred Hampton killed, everything they did to stop the Black Panther Party movement in its tracks. I didn't realize that J. Edgar Hoover literally declared the Black Panther Party the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. And on page 147, it says, in December 1969, a joint task force of the Chicago Police and the Cook County State's Attorney's Office raided the Black Panther Party headquarters in Chicago and murdering its key leaders, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. But there was also, in the 1980s, this is page 149, where it says, by the 1980s, living conditions for Black America were worse than before the Civil Rights Movement. In an even more ghastly demonstration of these elected officials' fealty to the establishment, Philadelphia Mayor Wilson Goode, the first African American to hold that post, ordered a 1985 firebombing of an apartment where members of the Black radical group MOVE lived. So it really, it's one of those things where whenever you learn about that part of history for the first time, because again, I was raised in the South, I'm still discovering a lot of things about our history that I was not aware of. It really makes you aware of the nature of this government, especially when it comes to social movements. They are highly antagonistic towards us. They will do everything in their power to try to stop us in our tracks. And that goes as far as the literal murder, literal murder. They're literally killing activists throughout history, which is just, again, it's another reminder that these people are not your friends. They did the same thing with the feminist movement. They did the same thing with the LGBTQ community, especially with Obama passing legislation to institute federal marriage equality. He only did that whenever he began to receive significant pushback from the people, from civil rights organizations. He finally decided to cave in and pass it, but the entire time before this showed no indication that he had any interest in doing so. Because a lot of how the Dem Party operates is aesthetic and image are incredibly important to them. They want to maintain a good image in the eyes of Americans who have not yet seen, if you will, behind the wizard's curtain. They don't actually understand how things are working behind the scenes. They're thinking, oh, if we vote Trump out, things will be totally fine, and we will be free of all of the horrific things that have been plaguing this country.
We can go back
But
to brunch, importantly.
exactly, yeah,
Um,
it's like thinking we can have like happy friend time, but that's
Hey, Alice, I just wanted to ask how much more of your summary you have left, because I do want to kind of tighten things up here and keep us moving. Do you
yeah.
have?
No, I've got one. Let me see if I can find it. One quote at the very end that I think is really important, especially, if those of us who have been involved in these movements. The power that social movements exert through protests, strikes, and disruption of business as usual is what forces the political establishment to address their demands and recognize their leaders. Now, again, there's only so much they can give, but I think it's really important for people like us to really acknowledge that, we have one of the keys in hopefully instituting some sort of change in the country, but we need to be aware that the Democratic Party does not like social movements. If we are too rowdy in their eyes, they will do everything they can to neuter us, to make us more palatable and friendly. In other words, think more like they do. And it's really, really important to remember, like, what's going to happen if you try to ally with them, just like the Populist Party, these movements will collapse. And that's what I got.
Thank you. Just wanted to give a little bit of breathing room to that. If anybody wanted to say anything very briefly before we move on to the next chapter, go. Feel free to chime in.
I would like to say just real fast about the killing of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, as well as the bombing of the MOVE movement. It's very easy to fall into a it's kind of like a trap that like the Republican Party is the racist party. The Democratic Party is absolutely a white supremacist apparatus, and I think that those are just the most shocking examples of that kind of thing. But I would like for everybody to remember that, yeah, like it's a party of white supremacy as well, albeit in a very different form. That's all about all I got to say about that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Two different claws of the white supremacist machine. Of the white, well, that metaphor didn't go well. The two claws of the white
All
supremacist
connected.
eagle. Machines have claws. I can metaphor. All right. I think I believe Queer POTUS is up next with a chapter summary. Is that correct?
That is correct. All right.
Over to you, comrade.
Okay, and feel free to break in and just be like, stop, and I'll stop. So I've got a lot, so you could just stop me whenever you want. So the first thing I just wanted to mention real quick is that Alice mentioned J. Edgar Hoover and his labeling of, was it the Black Panthers as the #1 terrorist threat?
It was. Yep.
Yes, that's
yeah. One thing that's interesting is that you also talked about FDR, and he lived across the street from Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, down on DuPont Circle when Wilson was president. And FDR was his Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was across the street the night that an Italian anarchist attempted to blow up Mitchell Palmer's house. And he actually came out and pulled Mitchell Palmer to safety. He was very adjacent to J. Edgar Hoover and Mitchell Palmer at the time when they were kind of building what eventually became the FBI. And one of the first major targets of their sort of agency was African Americans. The Red Summer of 1919 was taking place, and there were massive race riots, and they also spilled into class and union strikes and all this other stuff going on. And so that whole apparatus of FBI was coming into its own in that period of 1919, and FDR was right there along with them. So it's another reason to be critical of FDR. All right. So this chapter begins with what it calls a truism, that Republicans are strong on defense and the Democrats are weak. I definitely know this truism very well. I've heard it. Remember how John Kerry, a Vietnam veteran, lost to George W. Bush, who dodged the draft, and they actually criticized his military service and won. So that's an example of that truism at work. But the reality is much different. Democratic wars include World War I, World War II, the war in Korea, Vietnam. There are many more. Too many to really name in one.
I just super quick just want to say draft dodging is not bad. If you can not serve the U.S. military, absolutely do it.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
I occasionally get so into what I'm talking about that I'm like acting out the prejudiced thing, to like showcase it. So sorry about that. Clearly it's great to dodge the draft. Anyway,
I think the point here really is that they think that it's bad to like the establishment thinks it's bad to dodge the draft, and by that measure, Bush was a draft dodging Snake and Carrie was a patriot who served his country, right? That's the framework that they accept. It's not the framework that we're working with, obviously, but we have to be able to examine their framework critically if we're going to be able to make sense of this history. So,
all right. So there's also the Truman Doctrine, which was that we would go and fight communism anywhere and everywhere. 1947. Then John F. Kennedy, we will bear any burden, pay any price in the name of freedom. Even Walter Mondale critiquing Ronald Reagan in the 1984 campaign for not being hawkish enough with Nicaragua. And finally, the War on Terrorism, which had a lot of bipartisan support, which we'll go into. So he calls this a kind of political kabuki that's going on. There's this concept that politics stops at the water's edge, and that when the United States goes out into the world and has a foreign policy, it doesn't matter if we're Republican or Democrat, because we're all for America. For example, there was no candidate who ran for president during the Cold War that ever really significantly challenged the assumptions of the Cold War in any significant way. Usually it was just, I'll be, tougher, or I'll have better strategy. Nothing questioning the underlying assumptions of that insane Cold War that we were experiencing. So, and since 9/11, every single candidate touts their anti-terrorism record. Think of George W. Bush in the year 2000, running for president against Al Gore and criticizing Clinton administration for nation building. That's one of his most famous quotes. And we all know what happened during the Bush administration. There were a lot of attempts at nation building, even small scale versions within our own country, nation building taking place. So, but we're not really talking too much about how all that foreign policy comes home to roost in this chapter. We're simply talking about the consensus here between the bipartisan consensus and how Democrats sort of employ hawkishness in their foreign policy, while at the same time seeming like they're actually the party of peace. So let's see. So why does this truism exist? All right. So why does this truism exist that that Kennedy? We remember Kennedy for creating the Peace Corps, but we don't remember that he created the Green Berets. Well, then we go into this very long historical explanation, starting with the Spanish-American War. And if you don't know much about the Spanish-American War, it's considered our leap into imperialism, which is a ridiculous formulation because we were doing imperialism immediately, but because it was off the continent, technically we were not doing imperialism. So this was when America became conscious that it wasn't fighting empire, but it actually was an empire. And didn't seem to be too ashamed of it. We basically went into Spain under the guise of protecting the Cuban people from the evil Spaniards. And we pretended to support Cuba. We kicked the Spanish out. We got 4 territories for it, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And we proceeded to attempt to kind of police Cuba for a little while, but we kind of half let go of Cuba, even though we kept a heavy hand in its affairs, which is why the Cuban Revolution ended up happening later. We had the Philippines until 1946. So right after the Spanish-American War, President McKinley, he gets shot. Teddy Roosevelt takes over. He makes a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, in which he says that basically in situations where countries are not paying their debts or something like that, we can exercise an international police power. And one thing that this chapter didn't mention actually was that there were situations like this going on in the Caribbean where other countries like Germany, for example, tried to invade Venezuela in the 1890s because they weren't paying on, they defaulted on their debts. They had a revolution and they refused to pay their debts. That old chestnut. And Germany was like, we want our money. And the United States was like, should we stop them? Should we, like, what do we do? And Grover Cleveland was an anti-imperialist, so he said, no, we're not going to do anything. He was one of the last anti-imperialist presidents in the Democratic Party, because after that, the next Democratic president won't be until Woodrow Wilson, and he is going to go full imperialist, the super imperialist. He launches interventions into Mexico, Haiti, Dominica, Cuba, Panama, Honduras, Guatemala. He sends troops to Haiti to collect debts on the guise of collecting debts. They're literally trying to do that, right? Okay, the Haitian people resist. The United States stays in Haiti until 1934. That's Wilson. Wilson firmly believes that the flag follows commerce, and this even infuses itself into his rationale for going into Europe and fighting in the First World War. Because free trade is being violated by the Germans. They're blowing up our free trade vessels. We're just having free trade with England and France. We're just trying to cross the ocean, and they're blowing us up. They're interrupting free trade. And so that's a problem. And therefore, in the name of free trade / democracy, whatever, we're going to do this. We're going to go in and fight. And Wilson even goes the extra step of trying to build a sort of precursor to the United Nations, League of Nations, that would pretty much commit the United States permanently to Europe. That doesn't work out for a lot of reasons. One of them is because Wilson's an idiot, in my opinion, and a windbag, and he has a stroke in the middle of the fight. So he's out of the picture. We don't join the League. But I have been actually reading a book on Stalin recently about how Soviet Union joined the League of Nations, and it's one of the most stunning stories. I recommend you check it out.
Do you mind if I ask what book?
It's the Stephen Kotkin book. It is definitely not a leftist story version, but I don't care.
Very detailed. Yeah, that was a good one. I haven't read all of it.
It's detailed.
Yeah,
for sure. So let's kind of move up a little bit. So after Wilson, the United States becomes isolationist, and all of our presidents are Republicans. And they basically try to say, like, if we could just stay out of everything that's going on and just sort of make agreements that are beneficial to the United States through free trade, we can, probably do pretty okay in this world. But there are others who are worried about Japan getting very powerful in the East. And the United States have been looking at Asia for a while in terms of opening up more markets for our commerce. They're worried about the rise of Germany. And its potential to sort of control affairs in Europe. That's really going to cut into our ability to control everything that's going on in the world. So we're getting nervous. He says World War I turns the United States into a leading economy, World War II into the leader militarily. So what happens is that in this period of isolationism / more tariffs and things like that, more conservative fiscal policy, the Great Depression hits, and these kind of ideas and this isolationism sort of starts to lose its luster. FDR ascends to the presidency, and FDR, this is something he doesn't mention, but something I've read about, that FDR, during the Wilson administration as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was really one of the biggest hawks in the Wilson administration, was heavily pressuring and pressing Wilson. The Secretary of the Navy was actually a little more chill, and FDR saw it as his mission to show himself off, like his Uncle Ted, as the Assistant Secretary. And so he's like, build more stuff, more ships, and he was pushing Wilson to just do a huge military buildup under this guise of preparedness, just in case those dirty Germans come over here, that kind of mentality. So he ends up repeating this process as president. He antagonizes Japan, with these various sort of like embargoes and other economic sort of sanction type things. He passes the Lend-Lease Act so that he can start, so that American companies can start making money off of World War II. Because, you know, a lot of these companies are going up to the president and they're like, hey, you know, we made most of our money on World War I. There's another, like the carnival's back in town and we want to cash in. And there's very few presidents who are going to say no when that many people are like, we want to cash in. Those are donors. Those are, you need those to stay in power. Yeah. Anyway, so what's interesting about this, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here because I realized I took way too many notes and I'm not going to be able to get through everything. But after World War II, okay, after World War II, the United States had 60% of the total population of the 7 largest capitalist countries. So we were kind of like spared the worst of the war, and we made a shit ton of money on it. So suddenly we were in this much, much, much more advantageous position. And we had a huge seat at the peace table. See, Wilson got us in World War I because he wanted us to have a huge seat at that peace table. Didn't really work out, but FDR actually got it done. And it put the United States in a position of being a hegemon. The one flaw in this whole vision, this whole plan, in terms of the United States, was the emergence of international communism and you know, the Soviet Union and China and all of these places, because they were offering a different way of doing things that wouldn't allow the United States to come in under its banner of free trade. You know, that's actually subjugation and colonialism, the age-old colonialism, just with a new name, right? Free trade, commerce, all this stuff. It's a kind of a sick innovation on the old colonial model. And it's one that says that I don't want to like just exploit everything and ruin it and leave it in flames. I want to like almost like be like a gardener, cultivating the populations of my colonies to like do my bidding willingly. And FDR was like really obsessed with that, and he thought that that was anti-imperialism. So if you look at, I've read some of his quotes where he's really speaking and you're like, wow, FDR was based. And you're like, but you have to get to the very foundation of what FDR's actual belief was. What is anti-imperialism? It wasn't real anti-imperialism. I'm going to jump just a little bit ahead to JFK. I just want to say a few words about JFK because that's interesting too. JFK, handsome, lovely, man of peace. You know, the JFK movie by Oliver Stone said that, you know, he was killed because he wanted to stop the Vietnam War, and we wouldn't have had that war if he wasn't killed. All bullshit, according to this author. And I would agree totally. So one thing that's interesting is I had this boss one time who came from Massachusetts, and he was talking about how he loved the Kennedys so much. And he was like, Bobby Kennedy, if he was president, if he hadn't been shot, like he would have taken us out of Vietnam much sooner and all this stuff. And I was like, yeah, you know what's interesting about him is like he was really good buddies with McCarthy. He's like, what? And I was like, oh yeah, like he was a super anti-communist. Like he really made his rise in anti-communism. And his brother Jack like won the presidency because he ran against Richard Nixon, who was the star anti-communist in the country. And he ran to the right of that guy and won. Like JFK was like, I'm going to smash communism. Like he was so like, he was not chill, guys. He was not chill. So that's an interesting thing. And then he, of course, builds up and escalates what's going on in Vietnam. And Johnson comes to power. Johnson idolized FDR. So he did an FDR and just like escalated the shit out of that conflict. and only the difference was his was actually exposed and ended in disgrace, not like FDR's, which became praised in the annals of our history. So he was a failure. And then Jimmy Carter, who, when I was in his home, or when I was in Savannah, Georgia, on his birthday at the bar where he declared his candidacy, somebody told me he's the only president who never fired a shot. Well, he increased our military budget by 4% annually. He established that the limited nuclear strike policy, whereby we could, hit something with a nuke quickly if we needed to. He supported the Shah in Iran, one of the most repressive regimes, and he gave money to Ceausescu because Ceausescu joined the United States in our boycott of the Moscow Olympics. His Camp David Accords, which he's most famous for, got Egypt to recognize Israel, but took a sort of check on the power of Israel out of the situation, allowed Israel to grow and actually attack, I think it was Lebanon. I'm sorry, I'm a little confused there, but look at it's in the book. He armed the Afghans. I've read some books that said that, okay, everyone hates the dude who was in Nixon's administration, Kissinger. Everyone hates Kissinger. Zbigniew Brzezinski. You need to look this guy up, okay? This guy really sucks. I mean, like, the other guy sucks, but Brzezinski's terrible. He's like the worst, man. He kind of like got Carter to trick Russia into getting into Afghanistan in a way, and then push Carter arm these people, and those are the people who ended up hitting the towers. So, or at least some of those people, some of the people within that group that ended up being a part of that. Anyway, so that's blowback. Then you've got Clinton, who did 46 interventions, 20 more than the 4 presidents before him combined. Somalia, Haiti, Serbia, Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Croatia. In 1999, he asked for more money to bomb Kosovo. And he did not bother to ask the UN for permission. And so that was a precursor to what Bush did in the war in Iraq. And also, interestingly, I saw a speech where Bernie Sanders vigorously and strongly urged the United States bomb Kosovo, in this 1999 thing that took place. And of course, during the Iraq War, during the Bush administration, there was plenty of Democrats voting for more funding of the war, including in 2007, where a huge amount of Democrats in the Senate, I think it was 80 of them, voted to give $120 billion to George Bush to keep fighting in Iraq in 2007. And interestingly, 2 senators who did not vote for it, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. Probably just so they could tout their anti-war cred on the campaign trail later, because when they were actually debating each other, neither of them would commit to pulling out troops from Iraq by 2013. And then, of course, once Obama got into power, he optimized George Bush's apparatus of the war on terror. He put a nice spin on it. He stopped talking about killing the damn terrorists and the caves and all that stuff and smoke them out of their caves. He wasn't saying that kind of stuff. He was saying, he was going to Egypt and giving speeches to say, we want a new policy in the Middle East, but not much change there. He didn't close Gitmo. He did 120 drone strikes in Pakistan within his first 21 months of his presidency, which was twice as many as Bush in 8 years. He killed al-Awlaki, the American-born, I think, cleric, who was a drone strike victim with no trial. So it was extrajudicial killing. Of course, Yemen, the war in Yemen, regime change in Libya, no substantial pullout. What's interesting is the pullout from Iraq that he announced. It really was more like a reshuffle. A lot of those troops were put in Yemen. We still have the largest embassy in the world, in Iraq, and there were still tens of thousands of mercenaries hanging out in Iraq. And that's great. That's what you want, a bunch of American mercenaries just hanging out. That's good. So there you go. Democrats, so they're great. They're just great. Love them. Lifetime Democrat, lifelong Democrat here.
Thank you so much. And I think it's really critical to at this point in particular when Obama's vice president is now running for president himself, and there's actually a pretty good chance. I don't know how the election's going to shake out. We're right on the cusp here. I don't know how it's going to shake out. I don't pretend that I can predict how the election will go, but there's a good chance that Biden will win the presidency. And it's really important to remember that all the horrific shit that Trump is doing is a culmination of the things that the Obama-Biden administration did. And there's a quote from the chapter that POTUS covered that I just wanted to read real quick. It's at the bottom. It's a quote from Der Spiegel, the German newspaper, on the bottom of page 195, if you want to follow along. This is it talking in response to the extrajudicial killings in 2011. So Der Spiegel comments, today Obama's CIA no longer carries out kidnappings, it carries out killings. This means that the CIA can assume a military role and wage a war unconstrained by international law or the laws of war. It is waging that war in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan and Yemen, where there officially is no war. The advantage of the CIA's new approach is simple. Prisoners have to be released at some point, or at least put on trial. Prisoners mean the possibility of facing investigations or having to address journalists' questions. Killing is easier. Obama's CIA decides who lives and who dies. Yeah. And this is not so much directly related to the kind of imperialism that POTUS covered in this chapter, but it is related, but it's internal, which is to say that the war abroad is, of course, connected to the war at home, right? All of these expanded military institutions we've seen them literally come home in the form of hyper-militarized police. Another thing Obama did was to increase the existing program that existed under Bush of giving basically military surplus to police departments, and those were kind of the first taste we got of that was Occupy Wall Street, the suppression, militarized suppression of Occupy Wall Street back in 2011, and then of course absolutely, brutally in the repression of the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests back in 2014, 2015 in Ferguson and Baltimore. Right, and like we've seen such an obvious, right, like when Trump does it, with these, like what we saw in Portland not too long ago with deploying the feds to suppress the protests here. This is not something that's uniquely Trumpian. This is as much the product of the Obama-Biden years as it is of, Trump being a big mean orange fascist himself, right? The whole I think what's really, that I try to stress in my politics when I'm communicating with others, and especially on these streams, this is what we talk about with political education, is, when we talk about the US becoming fascist under Trump, I think that really underestimates the just depravity of what this country has done in its history already. Its atrocities that it commits against, indigenous people, against Black people. And there's a point where you have to say, okay, at what point has the US not been fascistic for at least part of the population, right? It's not to say that there hasn't been an escalation of those institutions. For sure there has been, and that's really worth talking about. But I think what we really need to talk about, and this is why I tend to really disagree with liberals about this issue, which is Trump is really not uniquely fascist in that way, in that respect. He's the logical culmination of both domestic and foreign policy of the United States over the last 40 years, and really is connected to the project of America as a white settler colony, right? So sorry, that was me going off, and I think we have a couple more chapters to get through before we can kind of open up discussions. So Mary, are you ready
Can I just
to...
say something real quick?
Oh, please, yeah.
Can I just say something just very quickly? I actually have to go now. There's a comedy show that I'm going to be in, and it starts at 8, so I have to get ready for that. So I'm really sorry I have to go, but I really want to say thank you very much for having me on the stream. Check me out, Queer POTUS, on YouTube. I got a video coming out tomorrow at 12 p.m., so come for the premiere. And that's all. I'm sorry I have to go, because this discussion rocks, frankly. This discussion rocks.
Yeah.
Hey, nice meeting you. Thank you for everything. That was great.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate the work you put into summarizing that chapter for us. I think that really is going to lead to a really fruitful discussion, and I hope you can join us again for our next stream.
Excellent. I will definitely be watching it.
And I'm going to drop a link to your channel in the chat. So
thank you.
Yeah, have a good day.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
All right. Mary, if you're ready, please take us away.
Can you? Okay, cool. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Right now?
Totally fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so the chapter that I'm summarizing is called "Can the Left Take Over the Democratic Party?" Which I'm going to preemptively say, no, I don't think so. And I think Lance does a really good job outlining why that is. So yeah, I'll go ahead and get into it.
Can you get a little closer to the mic?
The progressive. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
because you're cracked.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. Yeah. That seems to be whenever you
Okay.
drift away from the mic that your voice gets really crackly.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Now we can't hear you at all.
Oh my God. Now?
Yeah, there we go.
Not really?
No, we can hear you. Just...
Okay, cool. I'm not good at audio for some reason. Yeah. All right. So Lance Selfa starts off by talking about the Progressive Democrats of America, which started off in 2004 as a response to the Bush administration, the Iraq War, all of Wall Street's, capitalist shenanigans, as they do, and then voter rights and other issues like that. Because they were founded on the belief that activists can retake the Democratic Party from the inside and then move it left, which has been a belief that's existed since the 1960s with Michael Harrington and the Socialist Party. At that point, he wrote something in 1960 that was talking about the need for, getting rapists and other corrupt elements out of the party. And then at that point, we would be able to make it an actual truly progressive party. But as we'll find out, that didn't ever really happen, and it still hasn't happened. So, yeah, the Progressive Democrats of America, or PDA, self-consciously styled itself as a grassroots organization, but it was still the creation of political operatives who were tied to the Democratic Party. And again, the strategy of getting inside and moving the party left wasn't a new one. And that was tied into, doing traditional lobbying, but also having public forms of comment and lectures, public discussions and that kind of thing. Basically, that all culminated in the idea of building a big tent, which y'all may remember hearing that discussion or that term a lot during the primaries this year and stuff. That was what I thought of first. But yeah, so the big tent is in theory, I guess, building, a space that progressives of all shades can come in and have a say in the party. But really what it does is hold activists back from doing meaningful work on the ground. And it also helps push the idea that dissenting voters, like those who voted for Nader in 2004, are what split the progressives to, re-elect Bush, or in other elections, just re-electing ideologues. in any case. So that also waters down progressive messages because, you know, there are a lot of different like stages of being a progressive. There are, you know, centrist liberals who are not progressive, who think they're progressive, and then people like us who want like revolutionary change. So that like is another way that the message gets held back. And also that it corrals disillusioned leftists into voting for candidates who are aligned closer to the right than you know, to actual leftist change and stuff. That you can see examples of with John Kerry and John Edwards, Clinton and Kane, and now Biden and Harris. So Democrats usually take leftists for granted at election time, or progressives for granted at election time. So they then shift into courting centrists. And they'll keep doing that unless progressives actually follow through and break with the party and make our own apparatus for change. Also, you know, we saw this a lot in this election season too. They're really good at making campaign promises, but then once they get into power, nothing actually changes. Or they, you know, they forget, or they're like, oh, well, we don't have the time and the resources for that right now, so we'll just do it later. And that's not a very viable option for a lot of us, especially when, you know, like war, healthcare, police brutality are all on the line, and like threatening people's lives every day. There was a quote from Glenn Greenwald in here, even though he's been embroiled in some controversy recently. But I thought the quote was good. Let me see if I can find it again. One of the most enduring attributes of Obama's legacy was in many crucial areas, he has done more to subvert and weaken the left's political agenda than a GOP president could have ever dreamed of achieving. And I think we're seeing that with like liberals right now too. If Biden were to get into office, a lot of them would be like, oh, well, it's fine if Biden sends police or you know, like the National Guard into places like Portland to quell dissent because like Trump's not doing it. And Biden only wants what's best for us, so it's fine if he does it. And that's obviously a very dangerous mindset to have. Let's see. So we know that the Democratic Party isn't actually democratic. We saw this in both 2016 and 2020 with the Bernie election, or the Bernie campaign most recently, but also with Howard Dean in 2004 and Upton Sinclair in 1934, which I didn't know this, but he ran for, I think it was governor of California, on a very progressive platform, which, like, I guess one of his campaign tenets was to end poverty. And he got a lot of votes. He had a lot of support. The Democratic establishment, including FDR, ended up putting big money, or big business money, if I can talk, into the Republican candidate, and they formed a one-time third party to siphon votes away from Sinclair and finance a red baiting scare campaign. So I think that also just goes to show that time and time again, if the Democrats are actually faced with a truly progressive candidate, they're going to find a way to shoot that candidate down and, you know, dampen their political progress, whatever you want to call it. So, yeah, that's fun. Fun little thing about our country. So then Salfa goes along to talk about the Rainbow Coalition in the 80s, which for that group, whatever, electoralism seemed less important than its potential as a political movement. Salfa then goes to describe that Jesse Jackson was never really a radical, and says that he represented the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, I think is that acronym, the right wing of that organization that opposed MLK's emphasis on the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. And then years later came out as an advocate of private sector bodies of allies, rather than, like, you know, true progressive operatives or whatever. Jackson also went on in the 1980 election to put the onus of that election onto marginalized Black folks, especially like in terms of racial equity and racial equality. He called for them to listen to appeals from both parties, both Carter and Reagan. Obviously, Reagan wasn't going to have any, positions that like were I can't talk, guys. Sorry, were advantageous to the Black community, and Carter was doing a really good job of messing that up too. So, yeah, it just seems kind of hollow to like call to listen to both sides, So Jackson also backed down constantly at any kind of pressure from the Democrats. In 1987 and 1988, there was, let me see if I can find it in my book here. So the U.S. Navy had a reflagging and escort of oil tankers through the Persian Gulf. And Jackson called for a greater sense of purpose for the operation and for moral support to U.S. troops, no matter the religion, which is some centrist BS, I think. He also, I guess it started off in the 1984 campaign, talking about the inequity of the presidential selection process from the Democrats. And that didn't come up again in his 1988 campaign until I think after he had dropped out or something, after the primaries ended. And he didn't bring that issue up at all. He had, I guess, supported the Palestine Liberation Organization, but then in 1988 he just didn't. He refused to talk about Palestinian liberation. He refused to talk to the PLO until the PLO went to Israel and renounced terrorism. So once again, backing down from those values of progressivism. And finally, he sorry, guys. Find notes here real quick. So he kept an arm's distance from real fights against racism, attempting to avoid the appearance of running a Black campaign. When campaigning in the New York primary, he avoided commenting on a spate of police killings of Black and Latino people in New York City. For this reason, New York's leading Black newspaper at the time, the City Sun, refused to endorse him in the April primary, which I think is a very good illustration of once the Democrats or Democratic candidates start pandering to centrists, their messages get watered down and they lose progressive interest. But they're never, because they take progressives for granted, they're never going to honor those promises. So yeah, I think that's a really good way to show that the Democratic Party is just never going to be a vehicle for change. And also, Salfa talks about how the Rainbow Coalition wasn't really started as a grassroots organization. It was basically just a vehicle for the Jackson campaign. And then once Jackson lost the nomination, it just kind of fell apart. And then after all that happened, the DNC ran through Michael Dukakis and his VP, Lloyd Benson, who was basically more to the right than Reagan was. He had pushed for a lot of very far right policies. And let me see if I can find that. He was one of the few pro-Reagan Democrats in 1981. He had totally backed Reagan's reactionary program. He was friends with Texas big business. He supported aid to the Contras, the death penalty, the B-1 bomber, and the MX missile, mandatory school prayer, denial of public funds of abortion, and mandatory AIDS testing. And they tried to push this guy as VP for Dukakis, and we're like, yeah, progressives are definitely going to back him. That's going to be a great idea. And then, he lost the election, and Reagan won, and to fuck shit up, as they say. So yeah, and then the Jackson campaign just kind of rolled over for them, and they were like, yeah, okay, we're gonna just back these people. We have to, because we have other choice. And that just has happened again and again and again in my lifetime, at least. So
Is that all you have
yeah,
for your summary?
and then Dukakis went on. No, I'm not quite done, but I'm almost done.
Okay,
sorry, I moved away from the mic.
Just checking.
So Dukakis, once he got the nomination, went on to do that whole thing of well, who's the real conservative? It's me. It's not Reagan. Reagan's going to do some really radical things, and he doesn't care about you or whatever. And yeah, and every Democratic politician that I've seen on the national stage in my lifetime is too. And it's old. It's real old. So yeah, I think what we can take away from this chapter is that real change will always come from the ground. It's never going to come from making a caucus in the Democratic Party or like working from the inside and trying to build a progressive movement that way. Electoralism is a time sink, especially considering how much more useful that time would be spent, like unionizing workers or doing like mutual aid mutual aid food drives, and actually like reaching out to people in your community and giving them like direct support rather than being like, oh well, we didn't win this election, but just wait like 2, 4, 6 more years. It's fine, because people don't have that long. Especially like right now with COVID and everything, like, people are losing their houses and starving. So yeah, I think we have to build real grassroots movements and also an alternative to the Democratic Party.
Yeah, that was an excellent summary of this chapter, and I just wanted to kind of, before we keep moving to the kind of Alki's going to take us home with the last chapter here in a minute. But I just wanted to comment that, exactly both in the 2015 Democratic primary and again this year, Bernie very much played that role of kind of sheepdog, of progressive sheepdog, like, oh, here, come in the van, kids. We have progressivism. We have socialism. Right? Like, I hate to use such a crass metaphor, but like honestly, like Bernie has played this really fucking pernicious role as like the radical democratic socialist, but like, as Queer POTUS pointed out earlier, like he also like supported, the bombing of Kosovo, right? Like this is not right. Like this is so maybe he's a socialist by the standards of the incredibly curtailed political spectrum that is the acceptable discourse of politics in the United States in terms of what the establishment allows to happen, but he's still like very much within, he colors within the lines, right? And he ultimately carries water for the real power brokers in the party. And this is the same thing that happens with AOC, the same thing that happens with the squad or whatever. Like, this isn't, and again, I don't say this to knock them as individuals. Like I'm sure they're perfectly kind, gentle people, whatever. I don't know. I've never met them. But the point is really that, especially as Mary perfectly summarized this last chapter, this is not about their individual character as individual politicians. It's about the structure of the party and how the people who ultimately really hold the reins are not the progressive wing. I think Selfa says himself, the Democratic Party doesn't have so much a left wing as it has a left tail, right? So I think I take that metaphor a little bit further. I think it's a carrot that they dangle in front of the movements as much as they can. They try to make it look shiny and inviting, and then they pull it up at the last second and say, "Oh, you have to vote for the, centrist now. Haha, we got you."
Yeah.
Right, and anyway, so I could go. I will never stop talking about this given the opportunity. So I think I'm going to pass things over to Alki so that we can finish the summary and open up our discussion. Alki, are you ready?
I am.
All right. Take it away, my
Okay.
friend.
So chapter 8, it asks the very important question, why is there no alternative? And so Selfa starts off the chapter with saying, like, each election day seems to confront Americans with a Hobson's choice of one pro-business party that pretends to represent the interests of working class people, and the other pro-business party that doesn't even bother to pretend, right? Which is hilarious because, like, in some states,
the Democrats are listed as, of course, just the Democrats, but they're also listed as the working class party or the working people party. Right. Well, it's interesting that Sofa also quotes Russell Baker in saying that is it any wonder then that you're voting on two flavors of neoliberalism, just slightly different than the other. So is it any wonder that people stay home, right? That amongst most advanced Western countries, the States has a very high rate of voter absenteeism. So that naturally brings us to the question, like, why hasn't there been an alternative? And of course, well, there have been attempts, right? If we look at the previous century, we see a whole host of attempts. Naturally, one of the big obstacles to an alternative that Selfa talks about is the fact that just to get on the ballot, there are basically insurmountable odds, and you have to jump through a whole bunch of hoops that are, absolutely ridiculous, right? So that's one way in which both parties collude in order to keep third parties off the ballot. And they do this, moderately successfully. But I think what's interesting about the history, and this is what it talks about, is when you look to, especially a century ago, workers were not always so enamored with capitalism as I guess we sort of assume today, right? In 1912, we can look at Eugene V. Debs. He got 6% of the vote with the Socialist Party. And I mean, we commonly go back to Debs when we think about like socialist movement, but I mean, Debs really showed that it was possible to have a actual left-wing party and actually get votes and actually be successful. Even into the 30s, right? When you had, I mean, dare I say it, the labor movement was, arguably at its strongest. I mean, you had workers literally occupying their workplace. In Michigan, for instance, like in with the Flint factory strike, or in Akron, Ohio, with the rubber strikes, like you had workers actually occupying their workplaces with the support of the Communist Party. But Salfa, when he talks about the Democratic Party, he talks about how the Democrats have been able to co-opt and really just absorb any dissenting into its fold, right? And this starts in the 1890s with the populist movement, which I won't go into too much detail here, as we've talked about before. But we see even with the populist movement, the Democratic Party was able to really absorb it and to really take any strength that it had. Even in the 30s, when you had like these occupations at factories and such, the Communist Party still acceded the election to Roosevelt, right? He still, more or less allowed the Democratic Party to sort of capture the union of the CIO, and rather than creating a prominent third party, which they could have possibly done during the 30s. So I want to focus mainly the New Left and the 1960s. So one of the early movements that we see trying to create an alternative is the Students for a Democratic Society. They were part of like this generation 68, which wasn't just an America thing. You saw the 68ers prominently in France and well. But you see this movement arise as a result of the Vietnam War, and you see, a large support for people who are against the Vietnam War and who, want to attempt to have, dare I say it, a revolutionary, right? And you see new organizations popping up as a result of this. However, they were so afraid of a Goldwater victory, and if you don't know, We're talking about Barry Goldwater. Most of you have probably heard the famous quote, which I won't recite here, but about the Southern strategy and how more or less the conservatives were able to capture the Republican Party, but that's a discussion for another time. But you see this failure for the students of a democratic society to create an alternative party, right? They decide, well, we have to align behind Johnson because we cannot have a presidency, right? And of course, we can see this clearly with 20. But even at the time, Goldwater really didn't have a realistic chance of becoming president. He, well, at the time he was the biggest threat. He wasn't really that big of a threat that the students of a democratic society could not have tried to create a left-wing party. Then, meanwhile, LBJ, of course, his presidency expands the Vietnam War, it millions of Vietnamese, thousands of Americans, and this movement eventually realized that Johnson really just represented the same capitalist ideals that Goldwater represented. He was just kind of slightly to the left of them, right? And so when we kind of look at like what happens with the revolutionary left, right? They're unable to really kind of present an alternative to those who rejected the Democratic Party, and especially because even though it may have seemed to them like 1960s, for much of America, it really didn't appear as though that was going to happen. Like it did not appear like is that was going to actually materialize. And so these movements sort of fit out in large part due to things happening not just internally within the United States, but also outside the United States, right? Some of revolutionary movements sort of fizzled out because they saw Mao make, quote, peace with Nixon, and they saw that there was no possibility of a revolution blossoming within the 1960s in America. And so a lot of former radicals with nowhere else to go, rather than creating their sort of own movement, they more or less just joined the Democratic Party, right? They supported more, I guess you could say, almost left-leaning movements within the Democratic Party, like Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. But I mean, these were movements that they had once opposed, right? And so you see them just really moving away from revolution and more towards electoral politics within the Democratic Party. So during the Carter era, his administration sort of shifted politics to the right, and a progressive alliance attempted to challenge Carter in 1980, right? As the radicals were, trying to shift like mainstream politics, they kind of revived the 1960s feelings, the 1960s movements to create a sort of social democracy, right? And this brings us to the Social Democrats of America, right? Or excuse me, this brings us to the DSA, right? And so like the DSA formed as a left wing of the Democratic Party to try and coalesce what they saw as an unbound group of blacks, of organized labor, of farmers, into a sort of group that would hopefully be able to realign the Democratic Party. And the idea was more or less they were going to effectively capture the party for the left, drive out the conservatives, the quote unquote left, right? The quote unquote Democrats, and leave the Democratic Party a sort of European style social democratic party. And naturally, this failed, right? And why did this fail? This failed because the Democratic Party is fundamentally a capitalist party, right? No matter how much you think you can push it to the left, it is fundamentally a capitalist party, in the same way that the Republican Party is a fundamentally capitalist party. And the progressive agendas really do not set the party agenda, right? They sort of follow whatever agenda conservative, slightly center left agenda that the Democratic Party normally has. Not naturally, they also interest the ruling class has within the party. So there never really is the ability to create a progressive movement or progressive ideas within the Democratic Party, especially during this time period, right? You're not seeing the possibility to repeal the Taft-Hartley Act, right? Or create national health care. So this was very frustrating for individuals within the DSA, right? The DSA considered itself the left wing of a possible Democratic Party, but it failed to realize that, or it failed to push the boundaries of the Democratic Party to the left, right? Within the DSA rank and in 1984, the DSA was split between Mondale and Jesse Jackson and Gary Hart. And so you kind of see this fracturing within the rank and file of the party. In 1987, the DSA was also split between Jackson and Paul Simon, or just no candidate at all. The DSA wasn't influencing the Democrats. It was really the other way around. When it came time to endorse Jackson, the DSA asked him if they could endorse him publicly, right? The idea is they did not want to sort of taint his campaign. They didn't want people to say, Jackson, he's a socialist. He's all the baggage that came with the name socialist. And so initially, Jackson was hesitant of it, but eventually he did, allow them to publicly endorse him. The DSA's approach here was timid. It was not accomplishing the goal of the Democratic Party to the left or making socialist ideas more mainstream or possible in the United States. In reality, they were just following the Democrats. Now, the DSA would cite a lot of endorsements as, hey, we are moving them to the left, right? They would cite this as evidence that, hey, we're having we are actually getting the Democratic Party to adopt progressive programs. But in reality, it wasn't really the case. The Democratic Party really wasn't. They were accepting the status quo, and then maybe they would sprinkle a little bit of progressive programs or progressive, really just a nod to progressive politics at the on top. But other than that, they really weren't embodying progressive programs. They really did embody the status quo. You see this especially with organized labor, with William Wispissinger, president of the International Machinists, and the former AFL-CIO, John Sweeney, who both supported the DSA, right? But they did not promote DSA platforms within the AFL-CIO. When Pissinger urged workers during the airline industry to accept basically concessions, any sort of within the industry, and they refused to encourage IAM members to actually PATCO, right? And so this is a really big moment. The 1981 PATCO strike, at least for us, when we talk about labor, that is sort of the turning point. That is when organized labor in the United States takes a turn for the worse, because after Reagan essentially defeats the strike, he fires all air traffic, and within a year, PATCO becomes decertified. You start seeing a new labor busting movement during the 80s, along with neoliberal politics. And so really, as the Democratic Party 80s, and the likelihood of pushing the Democrats to the left is becoming smaller and smaller, the DSA sort of adopted this inside-outside policy rather than breaking from the Dems and creating a true left-wing party. The DSA became a party that focused on building social movements that were anti-corporate, but still focused their impact on electoral politics and electoral politics within the Democratic Party. So in 2000, the DSA was split between the Green, Socialist, and the Democratic candidates, and endorsed none of them, right? In 2004, the DSA endorsed Kerry despite most members favoring Kucinich or Dean in the primary, and stating that the 2004 election was the most important election of how many times will we hear that? And it was also the most important concern to Bush, right? Oh my goodness, how often do we hear that? Is the most important concern to defeat blank, right? So in that same vein, the DSA and Obama, right, believing that both local and national victories could position the left to play a role, but once again, they were committed to preventing a McCain presidency. For them, that was the most important thing. Yeah, Obama's not really all that aggressive. He's not really all that to the left. But we can't have a McCain president. That would be worse. The DSA as it existed sides kind of with a lesser evil, right? They adopted this policy of lesser evilism, and that, yeah, the Democrats are not great, but the Republicans are way worse. So we have to side with the Democrats. And by relying on the Democrats, DSA really was holding back activists, socialists, and people really truly interested in creating a left-wing party. And they keep them chained to an institution that is, a capitalist institution. It's an institution of capitalist rule, right? By remaining tethered to the Democrats, the DSA during this era, and to a certain degree today, which we will talk about when we open it up, the DSA is kind of holding back a lot of the potential for a true left-wing party, true alternative that is to the left of the Democrats. And so naturally now this leads to talk about the sort of vacuum that into the left, right? Because as the two parties more or less would overlap more and more, there left this vacuum which a party could potentially fill, right? And so the biggest potential, especially in the past 20 years, was in 2000, right? The Green Party campaign. It was, thanks to Ralph Nader, it was largely anti-corporate and largely pro-worker. You saw similar support for the Green Party during the 2000 election from trade unionists that you also saw to Gore, right? You had, almost equal amount of trade unionists supporting Nader as they did Gore. And, Nader was very popular with young people who were activists. Just recently, Radical Reviewer actually had a video where he talks about, will the left die under Biden? And he talks a lot about growing up during that era and growing up, like how cool Ralph Nader was with young people. And I think that's a really good testimony that really shows that, yeah, like Nader was very cool, active. Some people, to a degree, describe him as like the 2000s Bernie Sanders. Won't go into that. But Nader's campaign, though, it was gaining a similar amount of support that you could see with Robert LaFollette, his third party run in 1924, right? But unfortunately, the Green Party wasn't very successful it was relatively successful in 2000, but the issue kind of was 4 years later, they did not continue that success, right? The Green Party seriously challenged the Democratic Party to continue that success that they had briefly in the 2000 era, right? So naturally, that brings us to 9/11. 9/11 pushed American politics to the right as Bush started the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Democrats just straight up at least refused to oppose Bush's policies. They really were just along for the ride with Republicans, and in many cases, they just supported Bush's policies because that was just the general atmosphere. That was the thing to do at that point because we were going to war. But despite this, the American left still prepared to back whatever Democratic candidate the party chose, right? This was especially apparent in the Green Party, because in the reading there is a quote from Medea Benjamin, and where she basically more or less says, yeah, we were behind Kerry, That was the thing that we needed to do. Kerry was the best bet to beat Bush. It wasn't important for us to create a campaign that would challenge the Democrats, on some of the bigger issues that really the Green Party should have been challenging them. The big thing here was we gotta beat Bush, right? We gotta beat Bush. A Bush presidency is gonna be worse. So any challenges, they'll have to wait. We gotta beat Bush. This is the most important election of our lifetime, right? We gotta beat Bush. And so the Green Party, they nominated a no-name lawyer, Cobb, and his running mate, and in an interview, just straight up said, "Yeah, if it looks close in my state of Maine, yeah, I'll just vote for Kerry, right? Like I will straight up not even vote for myself to support the Democrats if the election looks close." The Greens really failed to make a campaign that year that meant anything, right? It was failed to present an imposing view to, for instance, occupation in Iraq or the Patriot Act. With, basically Kerry and Bush, they both supported those things, right? So Nader decided to run as an independent. And so Nader presented really an alternative, a left alternative. He opposed the war, he opposed occupation, he opposed the Patriot Act. He also supported both gay marriage and national health care, right? So Nader, even running as an independent, and even really with the odds stacked against him, I mean, he won 465,000 votes nationwide. The Greens, with their no-name candidate and their really lackluster platform, and essentially just saying, yeah, we're the Democrats but green, they only got 120,000 votes nationally. The failure of the Greens really a fight led the party into losing recognition in a bunch of states. I think it was 7 different states, and it really called their viability question when they really could have had the possibility to create a very strong left party for criticizing the Democrats on a lot of issues that really still affect us today and are still, very polarizing today. Once again, we see the left falling into this alternate lesser evil. We can't have X candidate, this is important. They keep falling back into lesser evilism. And so kind of what we see here is that one of the reasons why we have no alternative to the Democratic Party, no left alternative, is because in many ways the Democratic Party co-ops or they absorb any sort of left movement. But in many ways, Democrats, either directly or indirectly, they destroy any potential for a left alternative. They really stand in opposition, despite the fact that you have parties that are trying to challenge them and trying to push them to the left, rather than actually trying to create their own party that's to the left. And so that's really the main takeaway from this chapter, is that you see movements trying to create an alternative or trying to push the Democrats to the left, but not really failing. They fall into the evils of lesser evilism, right? We have to support this candidate. We can't critique the Democrats right now. We got to keep X out of the White House. And that is more or less my summary of that chapter.
All right, that brings us to kind of the conclusion, which I guess is my responsibility to summarize here. My summary, just because I kind of want to get us into discussion, right, as much as possible. I want this to have lots of, I think there's so much that we've gone over today, and I really want to give us the opportunity to talk about it at some length. So I will keep my summary relatively short, and basically just jump right off of where Alki left off in saying that, if we keep getting trapped in the lesser evilism is not just like it's an ideology. It's an ideology that keeps and it's a self-fulfilling one as well, right? We keep voting for the lesser evil, and I say we in a very loose sense here. The left keeps getting browbeat every 4 years into voting for a lesser evil, and the right red baits them anyway, right? Obama's a socialist Kenyan, foreigner, all kinds of other nasty racist words that I'm not going to say because I'm not one of them. Right? Right, and that's so. Like we were saying earlier, the Obama-Biden administration was in more ways than not a continuity of the Bush administration, and yet the far right red baited him anyway, right? It didn't matter that he was drone bombing more people than Bush did. It didn't matter that he was deporting more immigrants than Bush did in his entire term within his first 4 years, right? Um, None of that mattered. It was just, other team bad, right? And specifically, uh, right. So why is there no alternative, I think, is the question that's posed in Alki's chapter, by the title of Alki's chapter. The answer in the conclusion is very much, well, we need to stop fucking around, and right, and basically is to create an independent party that's truly um, never going to capitulate to lesser evilism, to, and just to unequivocally recognize that the Democrats are not an ally of working people in this country. They're not the allies of indigenous people in this country. They're not the allies of Black and Latinx people or people of color, et cetera, et cetera. They're not our friends. They'll never be our friends. And we should stop pretending that they should even be our erstwhile temporary allies as a bulwark against the far right, because every time they're in power they fuck us over and they fucking give the far right exactly what they want anyway, right? They roll over and have their tummies rubbed by the far right, right? Pelosi helped pass, Trump's, like, whatever it was, $700 billion defense spending bill, right? This is not a party that will ever be on our side. It never has been, and it never will be. And the only reason that we have squeezed any concessions out of it, such as we have, has been through the movements on the streets. And that's what I really want to get into with this conclusion, right? It's this very famous Howard Zinn quote about kind of politics is not shaped by who's sitting in office, but by who's sitting in, who's protesting, who's striking, who's challenging power at its root, right? And as the old wobbly slogan goes, direct action gets the goods, right? We have social democratic demands. Perhaps we want things like Medicare for all. We want things like, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to get those things by hoping and praying to Saint Bernie that, when we elect him president, it'll just all fall from the sky like magic. No, we want things like Medicare for all. We have to go out into the streets and shut shit down. There's a very famous, chant. If we don't get it, shut it down, right? I think that the way that the Democrats have really shaped the kind of the political mood on the liberal sphere, of course, and they have shaped the discourse on the left, is to even by doing what they do, they conservatize our whole framework. They limit our goals. They make you have to go through the proper channels, blah blah blah. Um, and I think, right, we get into these interesting questions. Okay, how do we build lasting independent organizations? Because it seems like the Democrats are really good at co-opting and dismantling those, right? And I mean, this is why I, as a Marxist, specifically as a Marxist-Leninist, make a case for organizing a vanguard style party, which is to say, to unite the most militant elements of the class, of the proletariat, of the oppressed peoples, and organizing core will serve as kind of the whatever you want to call it, the leading cadres that will be able to educate and be educated by the mass movement that will, again, I'm getting a little bit into abstract theory land, but I do want to keep it, germane. So, right, like we want to build an organization that is not just big, but that is militant and that knows what it's asking for, right? And that is kind of what makes the Marxist-Leninist style party, I think, unique in that, as opposed to other forms of revolutionary organizing, which is that, by centralizing that those kind of class demands, those right, and those militant elements, there's kind of uh, a sharpness and a clarity that's lent to those demands and lent to those interests, right? That there's something like so-called like mass politics that I guess has been sort of adopted by the DSA in general. I'm not, again, DSA is very, very heterogeneous nowadays. But and there are other forms of revolutionary organizing, of course. There's anarchist forms. I am personally pretty critical of some of those approaches, but I understand that anarchists have criticisms of Marxist-Leninist vanguardism that are totally valid as well. And I don't think I want to have that conversation here today. I think we're all from different revolutionary traditions here, and I don't think that we're going to figure out what kind of revolutionary organization we're going to form right here on this stream, certainly. I'm by no means an expert, but I do think that this is very much where this book leads us to questions about, and I really hope that you, our audience, are engaged in thinking about, like, okay, fuck the Democrats, fuck bourgeois electoral politics. How do we build, solid militant organizations that really represent our interests as working people, as oppressed people, and so on, right? So I without kind of belaboring my conclusion here, I just wanted to read on page 241 this really excellent quote from Comrade Eugene V. Debs, which is thus. Eugene Debs, the greatest socialist leader of the American working class movement has ever produced. Oh boy, that's Selfa's glowing endorsement. I almost don't disagree. I think there are better ones, but he's very good. I like Debs a lot. Offered a cogent argument for building a political alternative to the Democrats in 1900. Quote, "We hear it frequently urged that the Democratic Party is the poor man's party, the friend of labor, but there is but one way to relieve poverty and to free labor, and that is by making common property of the tools of labor. Is the Democratic Party, which we are assured has strong socialist tendencies in favor of collective ownership of the means of production? Is it opposed to the wage system, which flows in a ceaseless stream the poverty, misery, and wretchedness of the children of toil? If the Democratic Party is the friend of labor any more than the Republican Party, uh, why is its platform dumb to the presence of Coeur d'Alene, where the Idaho state government declared martial law against an 1899 miners' strike? It knows the truth about these shocking outrages, crimes upon working men, their wives and children, which would blacken the pages of Siberia. Why does it not speak out? What has the Democratic Party to say about the property and educational qualifications in North Carolina and Louisiana, and the proposed general disenfranchisement of the Negro race in the southern states? The differences between Republican and Democratic parties involve no issue, no principle in which the working class has any interest, and whether the spoils can be distributed by Republicans Hanna and Platt, or by Democrats Croker and Tammany Hall, is all the same to it. Between these parties, socialists have no choice, no preference. And I think that really puts a point on my sentiments towards the Democrats, and without beating this horse to dead, which is they're not our friends, and we need organizational alternatives that are decisively independent from not only the Democrats as a party, but from bourgeois politics, the bourgeois mode of politics, electoral politics in general. Right? America is a viciously racist settler colonial state, and we cannot. I forget who I'm quoting here, but the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We cannot use the tools of bourgeois democracy, and specifically of settler colonial bourgeois democracy, against itself. And I think that's where I will wrap up my summary. And now I just wanted to give everyone a quick little round of applause, because I am just so proud of how everybody summarized their chapters and, really added their own voices to it. Now I really want to give us a chance to discuss, right? Like we all read these chapters, and now we get to kind of think about them a little bit more depth. So I wanted to just go ahead and throw things over to my guests here, my co-hosts, to see what you think, and I think we can have a really stimulating and educating discussion here. So I will throw things over to you guys if you have things to say.
Yeah, I actually I want to touch on what Alki was saying in the chapter that you wrote. I put a video out back in May called "The Future of Leftism" that actually encapsulated a lot of what we talked about tonight. Like, you kept going, and I was like, I didn't realize like something I made like 5 months ago would be so prescient. But there's one point in particular where you were talking about, like, when it comes to the Democratic Party, the fact that they will, dangle the carrot in front of us and seem to be our friends. It's like, up until May, I was still, a fan of people like Bernie, AOC, but then I realized, like, Bernie can come up all the time and be like, my fellow Americans, I come here to tell you that I am like you, and I am here to help you and carry you on through the greatest tragedy in modern American history. Like, he can say that all he wants, but how the Democratic Party is modeled, and really our government as a whole, is you have the core of the government here. Everyone who enters the halls of our government, Congress, is tied to that. And there's only so far you can go before that rope around your neck tightens and you're not allowed to move any further. So, people like AOC, Ilhan Omar, I do still admire what they're doing in our government, because I think it is a good step in the right direction. But what they're still doing is working within the realm of reformism. And I fully believe that, like, you cannot reform something that A, was not built to be reformed, and B, was not built to serve us. Like, even whenever people say that it's a fundamentally broken system, part of me wants to disagree, because I'm like, well, why it doesn't work is it's not our system. It was not designed to be something that we could be a part of. So whenever politicians talk about, no, we let's just reform it, let's work within what we have, what they're doing is, that's just more language saying, don't venture too far outside of this, because if you do that, A, it's not going to work, because we're going to make sure it doesn't work, which is, again, why building a proper workers' party and, doing what we can to actually have a true opposition, not just to the Republicans, to the Democrats, but really this entire political system as a whole, because it's not for the people, it's just for them.
Yeah, like on that note with AOC, in a relatively recent interview on CNN, I think they asked AOC, are you going to be pushing Biden to the left, and like is that your position right now? And she quite frankly said, she goes, I wish I was in a position of privilege to push Biden to the left, but right now it's about getting Trump out. And I was just kind of like when I saw that interview and I was reading this book, I was just kind of like, wow, like the DSA, have they not really learned anything? And I mean, of course, AOC doesn't necessarily represent the DSA 100%, but it just seems kind of ridiculous to me. It's like, no, that was literally the point of the creation of the DSA, is to say, hey, to push no matter what the candidate to the left. Be like, hey, Biden, you need to be pushed to the left. We need you to adopt more progressive policies. And for her to just basically say, yeah, nah, well, we're not doing that right. We'll focus on that later. It's kind of frustrating, because when you're reading this book, you realize, like, wow, like this is still going on. Like this isn't like the past. This isn't something we're talking about. We're not talking about a movement or ideas from 20 years ago. We're definitely talking about the Democratic Party as it exists today, and as it's probably going to exist for the foreseeable future, right?
Let's not forget. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead, because that was basically my thoughts on that.
Let's not forget that this language, and this doesn't necessarily directly have to do with the book, but the language of like, hey, we're gonna push X candidate to the left, is like it implies that the candidate is the person doing something rather than activists, and that like the candidate is like the important thing, the agent of change, when that's like absolutely like not the case. For example, Nixon like passing Title IX isn't an example of him being pushed left. It's an example of him not being able to, govern effectively if he doesn't do a thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you. Okay, yeah. I would agree.
Yeah, and I think the point of this, as I think maybe I alluded to earlier, is that these politicians, regardless of their political alignment, will do things to appease people, to maintain their legitimacy. So if Nixon signing the EPA into law, or Title IX, like those are not things that, right, Nixon didn't do those things because he like necessarily felt pressured to do so. He didn't literally had, he's not exactly counting on the feminist vote, right? Um,
Right.
so, right? So when presidents or politicians, especially in bourgeois society, I think this is pretty particular to bourgeois society, but it maybe is more general as well, but especially in bourgeois society, politicians act not only to, appeal to their base, appeal to, their party, and their party, follow their party line, but also to maintain the legitimacy of the bourgeois state. And you can only do that if you, keep, throwing some crumbs, right? You can't just, right? Because if you stop throwing crumbs, if you act, if you appear to act completely autocratically, then you lose legitimacy as a bourgeois democratic state. That's all I had to say.
Yeah, no, and I agree completely. It's also like something that Eve in the chat mentioned. If the bourgeois are truly well and okay with Trump and they're not going to challenge him at all, I mean, what does that say? Not just about the bourgeois, but bourgeois democracy as a whole. If they're any, even look at what's happening right now. Where, for those of y'all who haven't seen this, but I'm sure everyone's seen this by now, there have been caravans of Trump supporters swarming Biden campaign buses and trying to ram them off the road, armed Trump supporters threatening the people on these buses. So it's like it's active terrorism, political intimidation. But even though all of this is happening in broad daylight, do we hear anyone from either party really saying much of anything and actually acting like they're going to stop it? No. Like, no one's doing anything. They're all stepping back and watching. While at least for me, I just turned 30, and this is the first time I've ever seen anything this blatant where this is essentially like fascism taking fully root, where these people are happily stepping in the way of our already broken electoral process and saying we'll use our vehicles, we'll use our bodies, and we'll use our weapons to make sure that your candidate doesn't win. And it's wild, like being in a city that is the epicenter of so much of this and thinking, my God, like this is actually really scary to be in this country right now. And not a single politician really seems to care about it, regardless of what party they're from. It honestly, like, I feel like the silence is what speaks louder than anything else. If you're going to look at this, you're not going to do a single goddamn thing about it. What does that say about you? You know?
Yeah, and I think that part of that problem is that the liberal establishment in the Democratic Party has like this sort of proclivity towards wanting to like reach across the aisle. And how can you reach across the aisle with like people who are going to sites of elections and intimidating people from voting? Like that's just not an effective way to deal with it. So yeah, I mean, like Democrats are very scared of criticizing militant, Trump, MAGA, fascist types, because that would reflect badly on their internally contradictory politics of saying like that we're all Americans and everybody has a right to vote and speak their mind and blah blah blah. You know, politics of politeness.
Hmm. But how much good has respectability politics ever truly done? Because it's not about being respectful. It's about being like, hey, so your ideas might not really be palatable to the wider American population. So I'm just gonna need you to like shh on that part of what you're saying, like scooch back in with everyone else.
Well, and I think the other thing is very much that right, you can't negotiate with fascists, right? Like the Democrats want to reach across the aisle. Well, that means that you're shaking hands with fascists, right? And as I said earlier, like uh, the meaningful distinction in whether or not we're calling this or that American party fascist or not. And Brianna of Brianna's Library, who's in the chat right now, we have a video coming out that'll cover this topic in great depth, which is to say, uh, the Democrats, even on their own, have really embodied this, imperialist, racist mindset, but like also, or not just mindset, but practice. Um, but also, if the Republicans really have embraced this kind of, more fascistic, like overtly fascistic Americanism, whatever you want to call it, um, settler fascism, that's what Brianna and I have taken to calling it. If they've really embraced it so wholeheartedly and overtly, then the Democrats are what they're really doing at this stage is carrying water for them by saying, "Oh, we're going to reach across the aisle." You can't fucking negotiate with fascists. You shoot them. I'm sorry, that's just like this is the history, if you want to talk about history repeating itself, and I've never failed to tell this, what do you call it? Parable, which is if you sit down at a table, if you're having a dinner party, if a liberal has a dinner party and they invite uh, 9 fascists over for discussion, at the table you have 10 fascists at the table. And I think that's really what stage we're at now vis-a-vis the Democratic Party. They're not going to protect us from fascism. In fact, as we've demonstrated through uh, the discussion that we've had today, the summaries that we did, they're part and parcel of creating the oppressive state apparatus, the prison industrial complex, the imperial war machine abroad, brutalizing Black, Brown, Indigenous people here, and crushing workers' movements. Right? They're not our pals, and they're not going to defend us from the supposedly worse, overt fascists. In fact, they've shown pretty consistently, and as we've experienced over here in Portland, the liberals, the Democrats, whatever, they have every time that we've tried to have a militant, counter demonstration against the fascists, they've told everyone to stay home. And it's just so fucking transparent that they want to control the narrative. They want to keep everyone, complicit or complacent, rather, complicit as well, but complacent. And, they're speaking to people who are, I guess, suffer from the mental habits and patterns of the chronically enfranchised, right?
Yeah, to go off of what you said, Melody, and also about something that Brianna mentioned, it's fascinating to me how Democrats always talk about Republicans and other forces being the greatest threat to American security. And I'm like, well, in my mind, fascism is the greatest threat to us right now. And who are the fascists? It's both parties. And one thing that really, really showed this to me in plain daylight was we had a caravan of Trump supporters come through downtown Portland about a month and a half ago. I went out and I streamed that rally for about 2 hours. And near the end, there was a small counter demonstration. Now, keep in mind, the people in these cars were ruthlessly harassing passerby. Every other vehicle, people poked their heads out of their cars and looked at me while I was streaming and made comments of, "Is that a man or a woman? Lol." Just constant. And like, I had never received that much transphobic harassment in such a short period of time, but it was constant. It was relentless. They were making jokes about physical harm, about sexism, about all of these things. And I saw trucks where the driver had like an AK or some gun in their lap sticking out the window. But what happened was, as soon as the counter protesters got there, and I was almost caught in this, and I'm really glad I got out, but the police were essentially shepherding the supporters and protecting them and gassing and attacking all of the protesters who were literally doing nothing more than watching, holding up signs, and also streaming themselves. So it's one of those things where, like, the Democratic Party isn't going to do anything to change this. We saw Biden's crime bill. We've heard what he's talked about as far as police reform. He's not going to support defunding the police. He's not going to do hardly anything. And you even look at the local Democratic Party here. Ted Wheeler is both our mayor and police commissioner. So much of what's happening,
Yeah,
he is behind that. And like, the fact that they even allowed that to happen in the first place is
yeah,
the most insane thing in the world. But again, it just goes to show, it's like both these parties are using the police as an arm of the state to hold people like us down, but also allow literal fascists to hold rallies to intimidate voters and to cause violence, and they don't do a thing about it. And honestly, I think for me, like, every experience I've had with these protests ever since May has done more to radicalize me than probably anything before that. Um, it's one of those things where I cannot stress how important just being on the ground and observing things like this is, to really see the truth of the country we're living in, like, for what it is.
yeah, absolutely. Tear gas Ted, war crimes Wheeler, that's what we call him. He's not technically a capital D Democrat because the mayor is a nonpartisan race in Oregon, but he is functionally a Democrat, just because he's a millionaire, whatever you want to call it, a trust fund fail son, whatever. Anyway, all of Portland hates him. Actually, I feel the slightest pang of slightest momentary pang of pity for Tear Gas Ted, because he's so hated by everyone. He's hated by the left because his cops keep tear gassing us, and not just us, but they've tear gassed like residential neighborhoods here. Um, so he's hated by, just kind of the public at large, but especially the left. And then he's hated by the right because they think he's Antifa. They think he's the Antifa mayor, because apparently, for their taste, the cops don't crack down on us brutally enough. And that's all, libcuck Ted's fault, right? He's not. Anyway, Ted Wheeler, though, is just a great example of this kind of, uh, love Trump's hate Democrat who then turns around and uses his cops to beat up actual, like civil right people violate civil rights that he supposedly supports.
Mayor of my city is too, like, she's actually a Democrat, and like our whole city council is, it's Democrat. I live in a liberal stronghold in Western North Carolina, and yeah, but then I think it was the first night. Then, like, the first night that we started protesting back in May, they tear gassed us, and then, like, every night for a week, they tear gassed us. I think once the mayor's, like, law firm was threatened, they started boarding up buildings downtown and even, like, on the outskirts of downtown, and, yeah, I think that was also, I think, like what Alice said, a good, like, point of reference for me to be like, "Oh, yeah, the Democrats don't give us any shit about this." Like, they're just as much of a problem and, like, a way to, like, propagate this, like, fascist violence as, Republicans. So, yeah.
Yeah, and they're already boarding up buildings all across downtown Portland. And one thing I've really been concerned about is, just because there is so much inaction right now on the part of both parties, you look throughout history, and especially during the 60s and 70s, whenever the civil rights era really exploded and you had so much violence being committed by the KKK. You had Tulsa previously, you had buildings being firebombed. With everything happening now, it does genuinely make me concerned for our safety here, because I feel like, you know, everything that we've discussed is culminating to the point where, like, I think whenever election night happens, regardless of what the results is, I see potential bad things happening. And it's just because all of those seeds have been planted by both parties, where they've allowed this mentality of hatred of people who are against fascism, people who genuinely want equal rights. They want the best for the people. We have been so ruthlessly demonized and painted as like instigators and anti-American and all of these things that I'm like, it's like it's a kettle, and at some point it's going to burst, because right now it's boiling, and it's boiling more and more and more. And the thing about that is, eventually you're going to have fire, you're going to have an explosion. We don't know what the inciting incident will be. Um, but that's one consequence of everything that the two-party system has been doing. With an unwillingness to actually work for the people. I feel like in a lot of ways the two parties like revile us in so many ways. Like, if you look at the legislation and the way they talk about us, I'm like, I genuinely feel like they have some sort of either genuine hatred or something for us. Which, again, election night, if something happens, I'm expecting very, very little from any politician, except for things like, well, this really isn't the American way, and we wish people would take these actions. So I think the important thing is, if we can just learn to have a conversation and work together, that would truly bring about peace.
Let's all
Uh,
hold hands.
yeah.
Right?
So we're running up on this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion, and I would love to stay here all evening. But I actually have my first day of work tomorrow. I start a new job. Yay. Um,
Luck.
yeah. So I am gonna try to I want to probably wrap things up in the next let's say 20 minutes or so. I wanted to Alki or Simba or both. I wanted to give both of you a chance um, to say a little bit more before we wrap things up here, because three of us have been kind of hogging the stage a little bit. Wanted to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to say their piece.
Simba, do you have anything to say? I have one thing, but I want to look it up in the book real quick.
Sure. Being one of two black folks here, I would like to say that When liberals, or sorry, Democrats, I guess I should say specifically, because this doesn't so much apply to like your average, I'm still with her wine mom type. But the Democratic leadership does have like serious contempt for its base, and it's accountable to very large organizations that have a whole lot of money. The Liberal Labor Coalition sort of died in the 70s, I want to say 70s, 80s, and since then it's been like full on, like it's taken a hard right turn, or not a hard right turn, but I guess a rightward turn once under Reagan and then again under George Bush, which leaves us where we are today. And to the average, like the way the Democrats obviously like feel about the average person is that they are like a demographic who doesn't know what, like how to govern, and like they don't, there, I remember there was this one time that a politician from California was like approached by a bunch of like little kids who wanted the Green New Deal or whatever, and they were like, "Hey, could you like consider signing the Green New Deal?" And they were little kids. This politician said like, "Oh, I've got like my own way to do things. You kids don't know anything." Blah blah blah. And then there's like the classic Joe Biden, "If you don't vote for me, you ain't black" kind of thing.
It was Dianne Feinstein.
Yeah.
Einstein, that was it. Is she from California? I think she is.
Yeah, I think she is. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Um, they have contempt. They do not believe that people know how to effectively govern themselves, and they believe that the black population in America is a captive audience that will vote for them no matter what, which is horrible and racist and very, very condescending. And this book like really exposes in very clear terms that, conscious or unconscious, like that's entirely the case. And the leftist approach to the situation has to be that no, people actually do know what's in their best interest, and people do know the reality of their own situation. The Democratic Party, like, very clearly has no sort of politics of solidarity with the people, and that is expressed materially as well. So if you're going to criticize one party for being horrible and arrogant and racist, you should criticize both parties. Is all I'm just saying. Is all I'm saying. Like, there's a liberal side of every bad thing that you can find about the Republican Party.
Yeah, well said. Well said. And I think, obviously I'm not a person of color myself, but Alice and I are both trans women, and I think, right, the Democrats play this game with pretty much, they play it with black folks, they play it with us too, in a different way, of course, but right, it's this. I think frequently when people bring up so-called identity politics, especially, I mean, like, obviously when right-wingers bring it up, we know that they just don't like it when black people or gay people get too mouthy, right? But I think there's this, what I do think is a legitimate critique of so-called excuse me, I can speak, identity politics, which is this shallow, like, more trans drone pilots, that sort of politics of representationalism, or whatever you want to call it. And the Democrats actually, I think, have really kind of made an art out of that. And right, like the whole, if you don't vote for Liz Warren, you're not a feminist, blah blah blah. Like, I actually just wanted to shout out Mary's video on imperial feminism and Hillary Clinton. It was really excellent. Go subscribe to her channel. Um, yeah. Uh, so I think, I think when the left makes those criticisms of so-called identity politics, we need to be, careful that we're not kind of uh, adopting, even if only accidentally, adopting kind of right-wing bad faith criticisms, right? We're for self-determination of nations. We're for self-determination of oppressed peoples, right? And that means that we need our own organization, and we don't need to take shit from fucking bougie liberal apparatchiks who think that they know what's best for us because they're the very smart people in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
No more no more white saviors, no more whatever you want to call it, boss ladies, boss girls,
Girl
whatever.
bosses.
Girl bosses, sorry. I know words. Anyway, Alki, you have your quote ready? Do you want to take us home?
Sort of, yeah. And so it kind of talks about the future, but it kind of talks about the Green Party because I have a good friend of mine who, before this, yesterday, we had a discussion about the Green Party. They're moderately active within the Green Party, and I told him about this book, and I said, I kind of want your opinion, and I haven't had much time to read about it, and so I actually kind of wanted to ask him, like, do you see the Green Party as the party that will become, or potentially is the best option to become, like, the alternative to the left alternative to the Democrats? And they more or less said they would have to think about it. They said that, in their opinion, from working on the campaign and being involved with the Green Party in the past 2 years, of course, they said, yeah. And one of the interesting things about it was we were talking a little bit about Howie Hawkins because my friend's been like, you got to vote Howie. And one of the things that kind of struck me when I got to the end of my section was this quote from Howie Hawkins and, like, his sort of conclusion when it came to looking to lesser evilism, and he says, Popular Front, Fusion, Inside, Outside, and Safe States are all species of the same genus of lesser evilism. By relying on the liberal wing of the corporate power structure to defend us from its right wing, the left surrenders its own voice and very identity as an alternative to corporate domination. And history shows, when push comes to shove, that the corporate liberals ally with their conservative counterparts against the people. And that quote kind of stuck out to me. It's really kind of made me think. And when I read out this quote to this person, they were like, "Wow, I didn't really know that much about." Or they knew a little bit about the history of Howie Hawkins, but they didn't really know much about Howie Hawkins and, like, his critique of lesser evilism. And this person asked me, they asked me a little bit before the show. They were like, what is your opinion of this? Like, do you think they don't know I'm an anarchist, by the way. But they asked me, what do you think, right? And so I guess my non-anarchist answer to be that, and maybe I guess my that as well is, yeah, potentially, like, the Green Party has the potential now, in the same way as in 2000, to become an alternative to, like, potentially gain large following. I don't think that the Green Party has anywhere close to the same following that Ralph Nader had in 2000, but I do think that the Green Party, the way that they've run their campaign, Howie Hawkins has definitely learned his history. History, they say repeats itself or it rhymes, but I think Howie has definitely from the history of the early 2000s and said, yeah, maybe the Green Party should form its own, like, separate left-wing entity and not just go with the Democrats like traditionally a lot of parties have. And so I'm really interested. I'm not, like, saying, like, I'm 100% for the Green Party or something like that, but I'm very interested in seeing what the Green Party is going to do. Are they going to fall back and, quote unquote, repeat history? Are they going to, if, let's say, Trump wins, are they going to say, well, maybe we mistake back then by critiquing the Democrats? Are they just going to fall behind and, fall behind whatever Democratic candidate comes next? Or, if maybe Biden wins, like, what is the future of the Green Party? I'm actually genuinely very interested in seeing what is the future of a potential alternative left-wing party.
Right, thank you. This has been a really amazing discussion, and I think there are a lot of questions that are still unanswered. That's fine. Right, and I just wanted to address a couple of things before I kind of start wrapping things up here. One is that I mentioned that I myself am a member of DSA earlier. Um, DSA, I think, is in a much different place than it was in the 80s, just because the 80s were such a much more conservative time in general. But at the same time, right, the composition of DSA right now is much more working class, much more radical. Right, I still have some very strong criticisms of, especially kind of the more moderate or conservative wing of DSA. You know, the kind of the Jacobin crowd, um, right? The Seth Ackerman, Eric Blanc, Bhaskar Sankara sort of, and I'm probably name dropping for folks. I don't want to be playing too much insider baseball here, but you know, basically, right? There are revolutionary wings, revolutionary sections, I'd say, of DSA. Some of which are committed to definitely like breaking formally from the Democrats, really um, and I think that kind of I guess my kind of assessment in general is that the fact that you know a explicitly socialist organization has I think our goal is to hit 100,000 members by next year. We're coming close, even if they're not all, you know, hardcore Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, you know, or anarcho syndicalist whatevers, right? They're still being attracted to socialist politics, real socialist politics, and a way that I think is beyond kind of the limits of bourgeois democracy. Now, of course, I happen to belong to a very radical chapter of DSA over here in Portland. I realize that kind of my opinions there are very much colored by my experiences with Portland DSA and seeing a kind of a very radical chapter in motion and seeing what they can achieve. I've been really encouraged by what I've seen, but I understand, you know, DSA is really heterogeneous, and there are some chapters that are very conservative, you know, very you know, oriented towards electoralism, and I'm obviously I would be critical of that if that was the only, you know, socialist organization in my town. I don't think I'd be involved otherwise. But so I digress there. But I just wanted to take a minute to you know, again, thank you all of my co-hosts for putting in the work. It really showed. You all did so much, just, you know, not for money, just because this is important political education work to do. Now, that being said, I am just a sec, folks. I'm fixing the audio. Don't you worry. There we go. Okay. If you round for the conversation today, I noticed there are about 10 of you, um, which is great. 10 people sticking around for this whole conversation. That is fabulous. I would say I left links to my co-host's channel in the chat. Please go subscribe to them, and please subscribe to my channel. I am almost to 1,000 subscribers. If I get past that 1,000 mark, that means that I can have a community page, and it's just a really amazing landmark to meet. And I will say, our friend Mary here with her channel Snarknotes. I'm sorry, I have this all rehearsed, don't I? only has just over 100 subscribers, so let's make sure that
You
we go.
deserve so many more. So
Let's
many more.
make sure that we flood her channel with subscribers. Please give her channel all the subs. But if you really liked what the continuing project that I put on here, it is a lot of work, not just from me, but obviously from my co-hosts as well. Please consider supporting my show financially over at patreon.com/aworldtowin. Right, you can support the channel for as little as $1 a month. And I realize that money is tight right now. This is a really horrible time to live in. So if you can't contribute financially, make sure to like the video, comment on the video after it gets posted, and again, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to share this with your comrades. Like, I want our streams to be, right, they're all archived on the channel. I want them to be a resource for you that your comrades can hear our discussion and hopefully get something from it. And we really hope that, that in engaging with this material, that folks can come to more radical conclusions about what needs to happen with this Democratic Party and how we should not be its friend and we should stop supporting it and uh, yada yada. Yeah, comrades, would love to, if anyone wants to just kind of give their last words, I will pass the mic around and let folks kind of wrap things up, and then we will sign off for the evening.
Yeah,
didn't say
no,
anything, but
I would agree with Melody. She has put in so much work with all this content. She's 10 subs away. So for everyone here, as well as people watching, share her channel on your Twitter. And that by itself will definitely get her there. Like, I know one of the things that makes me enjoy being a part of this community is like it's all about community. It's not just we're growing our channels, growing our platforms, but like we're fostering something really important here. So like even streams like this, where we're talking about really, really critical things happening in this country. 10 viewers is still a big deal because that means those people can now take that knowledge and go elsewhere with it. So I think it is really, really important. Share good content, study yourself. If you want to get into any of the books that have been studied here, do them bit by bit. But like just education, awareness, community, it's all super important. And it's been really amazing just being a part of all of this.
yeah, I'll add to that. So this is like my first time being part of like a community discussion, and it's been really fun. And I'm glad that y'all invited me on to be a part of it. And yeah, I feel like it was a good experience. The book itself was really good, and I really enjoyed it. So yeah, cool stuff.
Yeah, like I always love coming on Mel's streams. I would love to come on more often, but unfortunately this time of day is actually like my bedtime. Like normally I'm going to bed because I have work. I work nights. But I think one of the more incredible things is that we have someone who is actually engaging with literature like on the left and doing it regularly with other content creators. There's not really a lot of folks doing that where we read a book and we actually engage with the book together on a stream. um I think Mel is a very valuable resource, and a lot of the folks that I have who are maybe not necessarily leftists, because I don't know a lot of leftists in real life, but who are more left leaning and who are open to leftist politics. They really do enjoy these types of discussions with leftist content creators. And they really do enjoy the type of literature that Mel picks out. Like, she has always done a really good job of picking books that are interesting, relevant, and absolutely, crucial, and that really not a lot of folks are really doing. This is not necessarily the type of literature that a lot of folks like to focus on. And so it's incredible to be a part of this amazing project that Mel has been doing.
Thank you so much. That means so much to me, Alki. Oh my gosh. Simba, did you have anything that you wanted to say before we sign off here?
Thanks for coming to the stream. Always a pleasure to talk with all you lovely people. And I don't know. Some of you are socialists. Go socialize with your community. Some of you guys are communists. I personally am. So go get to know your community. And I was happy to be here and talk. And whatever happens, with the inauguration, or sorry, with the election and then the inauguration and everything, whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, we've got a whole lot of work to do. So, yeah, the people in
And
power aren't
this is
responsible.
part of that work.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much all I got to say.
Thank you, Simba, and thank you to our lovely, lovely viewers. Thank you for sticking around. There's been 10 of you solidly sticking around for the last, wow, like almost 3 hours now. How about that? That's been pretty incredible. So, yeah, see you all out in the streets.